There's something much better if you have a position of power to just say, yeah, I have a position of power and I want to use it for good. Instead of kind of pretending that you don't, or saying, I'm just like you, or no, I have a position of power. And as a Christian, if you have a position of power, if you are born into those elite circles, or you end up in a position that's elite where you have a lot of influence, you're not doing anyone any good to pretend that that's not real or you don't have it. No, say, look, God's given me this sphere of influence if you're there, because God's given us all unique spheres of influence. That doesn't mean it's better than somebody else, but if that's your sphere of influence and you do have an impact that other people don't because of the institution you're part of or your culture, whatever it is, acknowledge it and say, how can I serve faithfully in this sphere of influence that I have been given? That's the right move. So when you get a lot of the Anabaptists that he's talking about here, talking about how power is bad, well, they're people with power and they're using their own influence to write books, to influence people to agree with what they're saying. And in doing that, they're exerting power because they are educated people and they're charismatic personalities, and they're exercising power because to engage in a world of debate is to exercise power. But that's not power in a bad way. So I think we have to take the language of power and say, well, there are abuses of power, which are bad. But there is also just the recognition of this is how the world works. Like, there are some people that have more influence on others. And we all have influence on somebody. Like, we all have power. All relationships, again, we can't say all relationships are power. I'm not going to go with Foucault and say that's the only thing that exists. But it's true, like, that there are hierarchies in relationships and communities, and some, even if you don't have a structure, and this is the problem that you see in a lot of churches that say, well, we don't want a hierarchical structure in our church because we're all on the same level. We're all, we're all under the grace of God. We're all in Christ, so we have no hierarchy in our church. And especially, bishops and those kind of things. That's all bad. That's hierarchy. We don't like that because we're all one in Christ. Okay, well, that sounds all pious and such, but what's the reality of the dynamics of those situations? Where does the abuse of power occur? And it's true that in, I think, very hierarchical systems, abuse of power can be hidden the best, so it often happens there too. And there's no perfect system, of course. But abuses of power often go unchecked when you don't recognize the power. When you have a totally kind of egalitarian, and I don't even just mean this in the men and women sense, but I just mean in the we're all kind of equal and all the same group, where you don't have any kind of hierarchical authority at all. Well, what happens is, instead of having a standard by which someone is put into a position of power officially, and you have an accountability structure in which that person's accountable to other people, now it's just the most charismatic personality becomes the guy that everybody follows. Because this is how humans function. This is how society functions. Some people are natural leaders, some are not, in the same way. And so we follow one person. Or a group of people, or whatever. This happens every time you get any kind of movement that tries to eschew any hierarchical leadership. It de facto just happens. It's how we function as human beings. So when you don't recognize power, this is actually when you find a lot of abuses of power, because then that person doesn't have any accountability, and they could just say, well, I'm just the same as you. We're all the same. But when you recognize that someone's in power, or that there is a hierarchy in any organization, but in churches, I'm thinking of specifically here, well, then you can say, okay, we have people that are in these positions, but how do we make sure that we don't have abuse in these positions? And here are the structures, here's the accountability, here are the ways that we make sure that doesn't happen. So there are leaders, there is power, but as Christians, we do recognize that we use that power not for selfish gain, but for the good of others in a servant-like manner, as Christ called us to. That's the difference, not that we don't recognize that power exists in the world.